My name is Tom Mullaney. I'm a professor at Stanford, coming on 18 years, and I'm going to turn it over right away to my colleague Chris.
Hi, this is Chris Ray, logging in from Vancouver, BC. It's great to be here. Today is partly a celebration. So yay, we sold 50,000 copies of our book, but we are going to be moving on pretty quickly. This is a book that's made it around the world. We've had a lot of lovely surprises about how it's done in Japan or Taiwan. We've visited people around the world in Budapest and Taipei and Munich. If we haven't made it to your institution yet, do let us know. But we've met some lovely people. And this has really proven to us that people in all fields and disciplines really care about research. And so what we want to do today is introduce a new tool that we've developed since we wrote the book called Meaningless Questions Flashcards. There's both physical versions and digital versions. And this is something that researchers and research mentors can use to improve their research creativity and, again, keep exploring what is the problem that really matters to them. So please, just to kick things off, since we have a lot of people here today, could you just write in the chat, where are you logging in from? I'm from Vancouver. I know Tom is coming in from Stanford, but where are you today? All right.
Ithaca, Tucson, Milpitas, awesome. Weston, Los Angeles, Baltimore, Berkeley.
Hubei.
Hubei, awesome. All
Fantastic.
right. Yeah. New Haven, Ankara, Turkey, DC, Providence, Rhode Island, Stanford, I think we're right down San Carlos, Cupertino. Very cool. Another Palo Alto. All right, we're right down the street from each other. Awesome. Oh, and Joanne, I saw that you picked up the meaningless question cards. So I'll be going to the post office box right after this.
Yes, and Shanghai.
Awesome.
So this is really, really exciting to us, right? This is a global movement, and this is a movement really to improve research, how we do research, and how we mentor researchers. So this is something that is a very participatory activity. And one of the crucial things that we've discovered as we've been talking to various people is that mentoring and teaching are fundamentally different in some ways. So we're all familiar with the model of somebody lecturing and kind of knowledge transfer or decanting knowledge from master to student. But with mentoring, it's quite different, right? If I'm teaching you French verbs, you don't have the French verbs in you. I'm not going to bring them out of you exactly. But with mentoring, you're often trying to find out what is the thing that this researcher really cares about. And so it's a bit more like, and the metaphor we often use is, imagine you're going to see the eye doctor, and the ophthalmologist is the specialist. They have all the fancy equipment, they have the degree, they have the qualifications, but they lack that one piece of information as they are testing you. Is this clear or is that clear? And so it really is incumbent on the person in that other position who's not the expert, so to speak, to not lie to their eye doctor, but to tell them honestly, really, what is it, what's clear and what's not clear. And so in research situations, people often end up kind of lying to their eye doctor. And we want to avoid this because you have to realize that whatever the person's qualifications, the research experience is greater than you, they're still dependent on you. Only you can see through your eyes. And so we need different techniques to really empower mentors to use their expertise to help the researcher. And I think an adjunct to this is you really want to avoid trying to impress whoever you're talking to in your research conversation. So we all have a performative intelligence that's extremely important, right? This helps you get into school. This helps you get your book proposal accepted by a publisher. So it's really, really important. But often we need to kind of, check that, like have it just relax on the couch and let our genuine intelligence shine through, where we can be honest, we can be vulnerable, and even a little bit inarticulate in trying to identify what's going on for us. And so if you're ever mentoring another researcher, you have to realize that this type of vulnerability and honesty doesn't happen automatically because there is often a power asymmetry in the relationship. And even when you're mentoring in the mirror, it's quite difficult to bring out your best. And so what we want to talk about today and actually try out with some people is some different ways to bring out our best in these research situations. So we're going to do a few things here. There are essentially 3 mentoring methods that we want to talk about. One we call just ask meaningless questions. And this is something we would consider to be an inductive method. You have a source, how do you work with it? And just respond to it authentically. And we have an online worksheet that can be used for this. But then if you generate a lot of questions about your source or your topic or your thing, right, what do you do with these questions? And so what to do with research questions is really crucial for any kind of publishing, any kind of project building. And then the last thing we want to talk about is how you can explore new dimensions using a more deductive method, right, using categories. And this is where the flashcards can be one really useful tool. And I want to mention, we really want this to be participatory. And so we had sent out a call for people to share an actual research source that they are working with. We got a few responses.
Thank you. There was a flood of responses. So we're so sorry we only get to choose one.
And so we're gonna use a real example here, and we're gonna ask for your help to help this one researcher and to share questions for them that you have about their source, a source that you've never seen before, because we're going to show how you can use these 2 methods of meaningless questions and what we call dimensions of inquiry to really explode a source into many questions and then be prepared to do something with those questions going forward. So this is something we're going to actually practice. We're not just going to talk about.
So yeah, let me dive into the first of these sort of techniques, and this is ask meaningless questions. So we're introducing the meaningless question flashcards. What is a meaningless question? How does it help your research? Why ask them and what to do with them? We're going to kind of get started with that. And I want to start with a vignette that over the last, I don't know, 3 months, Chris and I have brought up more and more in our workshops. We just did we had a 2-week sprint in which we did workshops at Purdue, Villanova, UPenn, MIT at the Whitehead Lab, and a variety of others, and it kept coming up, is the story of, as we speak, how the ancient world, the ancient Greco-Roman world, is being entirely rewritten and re-understood by scholars. And that originally there was a notion that the world at large of the Greco-Roman world was this pristine white alabaster landscape of white columns and white statues. And for over mainly a millennium, this is the image that is in film and in literature and many ideas are stacked on top of this. Well, recently, thanks to the work of a team largely based in Western Europe, but elsewhere, the entire ancient world is being entirely rewritten as we understand it. And instead of this pristine white alabaster landscape, it looks more like that the ancient Greek and Roman world was like Mardi Gras on steroids. It was just this flood of color. All of those statues were probably painted. All of those columns and buildings were probably painted in quite vivid colors. And the question is, so this is a paradigm shifting moment in research. So the question is, where does this amazing research come from? Surely the person who came up with this insight was a genius, because genius questions come from genius people, right? We have Archimedes, we have the eureka moments. And what we try to say and really explain is that genius questions do not come from geniuses. They come from an incredibly basic 3-step process that is at every human being's disposal. And the 3-step process is extremely simple. The first thing is the simple act of noticing. And this is an act that one doesn't actually need to train themselves to do. It just comes with the hardware of being a human being. And in the case of this research, what someone noticed, and in fact, many people we now noticed, were tiny flecks of paint on certain statues or on certain columns from the ancient world, like tiny, tiny flecks of paint that a group of people were taking notice of. But something then special happens, which is there's this next step where someone takes the metacognitive step, the sort of out-of-body looking at oneself in the mirror step of saying, wow, not only I'm noticing these flecks of paint. Every time I look at a statue, I find myself squinting really close at them to see if I can find little traces of color. And then a third step, and here is where the road diverges between researchers and basically everybody else is giving oneself the permission to look into the thing that one has noticed. In this case, researchers in Germany and other parts saying, let me try to find other statues that have flecks of paint. Let me try to work with the curators to do a chemical analysis of this fleck of paint to see what color it is. Let me get different imaging software to reveal perhaps traces of color on statues that I can't see with the naked eye. Let me look into this. And the simple act of noticing a fleck of paint, noticing that you are noticing a fleck of paint, not simply letting that go by. And then 3, not tricking yourself into saying, who am I? Who am I to ask a question like this? I'm sure someone much smarter than me has looked into this and dismissed it. I'm sure someone smarter than me has answered this. I hope no one heard me ask that question. Otherwise, they might throw me out of my institution. Instead of that, saying, let me just look into it, gives us a paradigm shift, a thing that will rewrite basically the history of, well, certainly the Western world, but all of these many other things that are stacked on top of the assumption that the world was one way, and in fact, it was another. So the question that we as mentors of researchers really need to start thinking about, and researchers that we all are in this room ourselves, is not how can I have more fleck of paint questions? That's not actually the problem. We are having fleck of paint questions all the time. The question is, what is the mechanism by which I can surface and make visible the fleck of paint questions that my students, my advisees, my mentees are having, or that I am having? And that's what this exercise is fundamentally about. That's what meaningless questions are all about. We're going to do this right now, and we're going to use the chat function. Right now, the same chat function you use to tell us where you're coming in from. Here is what we're going to do. Chris and I are going to put 3 minutes on the clock, and we're going to show you a source. The source is on the next slide. You will have 3 minutes to ask as many meaningless questions as you possibly can. And meaningless is defined very, very simply in 2 ways. 1, do not try to impress anyone with your intelligence. Don't try to make Chris and me go, whoa, that's a smart person. Look at your vocabulary. Don't reapply to whatever institution you might already be a student or a colleague of. That's 1. And 2, no matter what we show you, allow your meaningless questions to wander in any direction they want to go. If we were to give you a picture of a coffee cup, you can ask questions about caffeine and coffee culture and coffee crops and things like that. But you could also, if your mind goes this way, ask about the chemical composition of ceramic, the transportation of fragile objects, the printing of text on irregular surfaces. You just let your mind go in any direction it wants to go. Don't filter out on that basis, and don't try to sound smart. Allow a fleck of paint question to surface. Okay, is everyone ready? We're going to put 3 minutes on the clock. Here you go. Yeah, we're going for quantity here, not impressiveness. All right, I'm going to put 3 minutes on my clock, and here we go. Okay, just to get the ball rolling, what font is that? Why is the trans in trans fat italicized? How come those black bars are like different widths and they don't extend to the full size of the label? Things like that. Those are meaningless questions. Awesome. How did people find nutrition info before the standard box? Why these colors? Why are vitamins given letters? Awesome. Yeah, why is vitamin A instead of vitamin G? What is nutrition? How often is food tested to update this info? Who designed this template? Keep it coming. If you find yourself struggling, that means you're placing too many filters on yourself. You're secretly trying to be performative in your intelligence instead of raw and inarticulate. How are daily values calculated? What kind of fiber isn't dietary? That's awesome. How can consumers verify? That's awesome. Do the colors have any meaning? What is a serving? All right. That's 1 minute, 30 seconds. Keep going. Push yourself. So we got 1 minute, 40 seconds left. How do they measure the components? How much protein does the human brain need to work well? Awesome, Ray. That's great. What types of carbs are left out? Is the serving size enough or too much? Are there other words for trans fat? When did a cup become a measure unit? What does the total fat, what is the total fat is listed in the first yellow row? Someone noticed, I think the last time, the total fat is 9 grams, but if you add up saturated fat and trans fat, it only equals 4.5 grams. Where's the other fat? What does container mean? What is added sugar? Why did you show this picture? Very nice. Very metacognitive. Love it. All right, we've got 60 more seconds. Keep going. It's hard, isn't it? It'd be a lot easier if I just asked you to riff performatively on this, but we're asking you to go meaningless. Why is the daily count 2000? What printers were used to print the label? That is a question after my own heart. I wonder if the labels follow the same format in other cultures. Fantastic. Why is carbohydrate singular when it's split into multiples? Ooh. One question we heard is, why is the H in cholesterol silent? How many units of this product sell? Why not also show with a picture that's more intuitive? How healthy is this? Fantastic. Why is the serving size 227 grams? 10 seconds left. From Paulette. How are these numbers derived? Who approves the numbers? Why are there indentations? I love it. Why are there indentations? That's a fantastic meaningless question. Do people read this? All right, time is up. Okay. So we're going to come back to what just happened here. Kind of what just did. I mean, Chris and I, I teach a class of 200 people. I use this is the attendance mechanism for every class. At the beginning, we just have like a warm up, but it also doubles as attendance. What exactly are we warming up? What are we doing here? I mean, as you can see, this is an inductive method. We haven't given you any guidance other than the basic criteria of meaninglessness, and you all did amazing. So within 10 seconds by this method, you had everything you needed, or many of you, to figure out, okay, I get what Chris and Tom want me to do. Let me dive in and let me kind of come at this. And you came at it from lots of different directions. And so you really took the second rule of meaninglessness seriously. And so this is the starting point for the method that we want to talk about. Now, Chris is going to lead you through the question, what do we do with the questions that you all generated in 3 minutes?
So what comes next, right? If you generate many, many questions, how do you use these questions? There are several things you can do. One is to see how you've responded to these questions. Maybe there's some that you kind of threw out, but you weren't so sure if they're really ones that you care about. You can essentially say, do I care about this question? How do these questions cluster? Like, are they related to each other? You can do searches for answers. You can actually answer some questions, and then you can go back again. So we're going to go through some of these different options for how you can use these questions, where you can go from your meaningless beginning. So for example, let's say within the list of questions that you or your mentee generated, you ask questions like, who decided that a serving size equals 1 cup? Or why did they choose a sans serif font for this? Or why aren't all of the carbs listed, 6 grams plus 4 grams, right? It's less than 34 grams, right? There are other carbs that were left out from here. Or does the nutrition value change if the milk isn't refrigerated? So these are very different types of questions. So essentially 3 things that you can do, and we're going to talk about these different categories. You can analyze your questions, you can share them with other people in small or big groups, and then you can answer them. So if we start with analyzing your questions, one of the things that you can do that's very powerful is to try to find the patterns in our meaningless questions. This helps to surface those potential areas of concern, right? These fleck of paint questions, right? What is the thing that is really bothering us? What is behind the questions that we're asking? And then if we are talking with other people and we're trying to help them with their research, we all will begin, trying to make helpful suggestions, but we essentially want to improve our recommendation algorithm. And so if we can identify what is the shared concern behind all of these fact-focused questions, that's going to help us make much better recommendations for people. So another thing that you can do for analyzing is to think of what are the kinds of questions that people seem to be asking. So for example, if you look at questions, if you have someone who's asking questions about who decided that a serving size equals 1 cup, asking about the types of carbs listed, or about nutrition value changing if the milk isn't refrigerated, think what types of questions are these, right? What is kind of motivating the researcher who is asking this type of questions? So if you contrast someone who asks those types of questions with someone who is asking about the font, right, the font color, the specific colors and the design of the packaging, these people are reacting to the same source in very different ways. And the questions that they have generated provide a really useful type of evidence for them to identify and for their mentors to identify what the person is really getting at. And this is one question that actually came up when we did this at the MIT Whitehead Institute, right, with a bunch of biomedical researchers. Someone asked this question that we had never thought of before of, would nutrition values change if the milk were not refrigerated, right? I don't know the answer to that question offhand, but this immediately makes me think, wow, maybe this researcher would be interested in studies about refrigeration. And so this is one way that I feel like my recommendation algorithm changed. I am more empowered to help somebody who's in a radically different field from me, and we can have a conversation about the implications and what's behind their question. So when that question surfaces, I and probably the other people in the room have a lot more questions that come out and come to the fore. So this is something that really helps in a lot of ways. And it helps for research conversations on a small scale. So for example, if you have one person choose a source, they bring it to office hours, they talk to a peer, they talk to someone at a conference, and they have the source in common that they can share. And they can kind of go through the meaningless questions generation exercise and activity together. That's something that can be tremendously productive. And you just want to make sure that you leave a trace so that when you leave the meeting, you actually have some material to analyze. So you can do this on a small scale. Tom, you want to jump in and
Yeah, if
add
I could
something?
jump in here. And also, if you're running, I don't know if anyone here has advisees or you hold office hours and you have those students come into your office hours and you get the impression that they're trying to impress you with really large sounding words of like, tell me what you're interested in. And it sounds almost like they're reapplying to your college or your high school or your university. And what you really want is just to hear their fleck of paint questions. This is a way to cut through all of that and get right down to their actual brilliance instead of their performative intelligence. If you do a meaningless question thing with them in office hours, you actually get to hear their brilliant fleck of paint questions like that.
So this is something that can be really helpful and can help get past the, I just found a source. What does it all mean? Trying to jump to a conclusion right away. This can be much more productive. And when I say productive, right, you can do this at a small scale activity, just one-on-one, but you could also do this in a large enrollment course. So both Tom and I have done this in our courses where you show one source and then you have everybody jump in and ask questions, just like we did right now over 3 minutes. So this is an example from I think a 200-person course that Tom has been teaching this term. So this is also, fresh. This is something you can do immediately in just a matter of minutes. And imagine doing this with one person's source, right? Not just a kind of an instructor chosen source, but somebody's actual source. And they're struggling, they're stuck. Everybody can jump in, and I guarantee you they're going to be helping this researcher generate some new ideas. So this is something that is really, really scalable. You can also answer questions, right? So you generate many questions, but it's not your full to-do list. But you will want to go back and you can circle, a favorite meaningless question, like why did they choose a sans serif font? And you can then think what are the methods that I need in order to answer that question? So in this case, it may be archival and oral historical methods. And you can find an answer, right? There it is, right? You can have people do this on the spot in class. You can do it on the spot in office hours as well. And then after you found the answer, you all of this is iterative, right? You're not just asking one question. You're not even just asking one batch of questions. You're also thinking, how am I responding to the question that I posed? Does it really excite me? If you've chosen a favorite MQ, it probably has excited you. And then after you find the answer, go back and kind of check your EKG again. Like, is your heart beating faster when you find the answer to your question? And if it is, that tells you useful information. If it's not, that's also extremely useful. And so there are a lot of different outcomes of asking all of these questions and answering the questions. For answering, you might actually find the answer to the question you asked. You might end up actually finding the answer to a different meaningless question. So there may be that unintended benefit. You could end up finding new sources as well, right? Sources that you didn't know existed. But you'll almost certainly be coming up with new meaningless questions. And there's also one possibility, which is that you went in thinking, this is the problem underlying my question, but you end up leaving problem with someone else, so to speak. You end up kind of going out of the room with, and again, if you're a researcher, this type of like wandering eye is actually a good thing, right? You do want to consider the possibilities and think, where does my heart really lie? So if you end up finding a completely different problem through this exercise, that's really useful. And so you don't feel like you have to be beholden to the prior self that started this project. It's better and it's more honest if you actually change. So the more meaningless questions you can generate, the better. This is evidence for you, and it's evidence for whoever you're working with on this project.
Yeah. So what we're going to transition to now is this question of, I wonder, we saw from the chat that it seemed as if people were getting maybe to 10 questions, maybe 8 questions, maybe 15. We have conducted this workshop, these exercises many times, and we want to tell you, which is hopefully both encouraging, but also kind of, revealing. You take a second-year undergraduate student and an associate dean at Princeton University, and they will both max out at about 15 meaningless questions as like top performance on the first attempt at doing this. And what's amazing about that is if we were in a room with a lot of really intelligent, dynamic, creative people, and we had just asked them to tell us their, kind of allow their performative intelligence to talk about an FDA nutrition label, chances are really good that they would have gone on for quite some time. Foucault this, biopolitics that, late stage capitalism, the Anthropocene, they would have really just, dazzled us with their intelligence. But when asked to just generate fleck of paint questions, they ran out of steam. And the reason for that is quite simple. From high school onward, this performative intelligence is built out. It is worked out. It is exercised over and over and over again. That musculature is really, really built out. The side of us that is part of us, the musculature that is about inarticulate, raw, instinctual kinds of questions, is systemically atrophied over time. And meaningless questions is all about bringing those two back into balance. It's not to the exclusion of performative intelligence. You want performative intelligence. You need it. It has served you. It's part of your family. But what you don't want is this vast imbalance between the two. And so let's say that you face the same maximum as an undergraduate at UCLA or an associate dean at Princeton or University of wherever. You also kind of ran out of steam at about 10. How do we push from 10 to 50 to 100 to quite literally a place where, given a sufficient amount of time, one person on their own could produce as many meaningless questions about that FDA label as a class of 200 people could? It sounds kind of daunting, but it's in fact very, very easy. And in fact, if we were to do the meaningless question exercise again right now, chances are really good that your number would already start to climb. But this is where we want to dive into, I guess, the debut part of our discussion today, which is meaningless question flashcards, the physical version and the virtual version. These are designed to help you push up your MQ score. We're kind of cheekily contrasting the idea of an MQ score as opposed to an IQ score. That MQ is a measurement, a way of measuring a different side of our intelligence, and we want it to be as strong as our performative intelligence. So kind of a quick overview of what these look like before we dive in. There are 30 cards in the physical deck. There are, 35 cards in the physical deck. There's 25 dimension of inquiry cards we're going to talk about. There are 5 sort of instruction how-to cards. And then there are 5 blank cards where you get to make your own dimensions, and we'll talk about that. There is a virtual online one I know many of you have been exploring. This is just for those of you who are outside of the US where it's a little bit difficult for us to ship the physical cards, but also those of you inside who want to use both the physical and the virtual. There's the online version. And then probably even most importantly, there is a large and ever-growing number of video tutorials and other kinds of supporting documents that show how you use each of these dimensions of inquiry. So if you do already have the physical cards, if you purchase them and you receive them in the mail, make sure to scan that QR code on the card itself, because it will bring you to this place with all of these different tutorials. And if you're using the virtual version, make sure that you click, let me see if it will show here. Make sure that you click on a link at the bottom of the card that says, see bind in action, or see this dimension of inquiry in action. So what is a dimension of inquiry? How do you use these cards? And we're going to do it right now, and we'll show you. Let's get started. And this is the goal. So right now, everyone normally when we start this is about the 5 to 10 to 15 range. This is, it's no shade, no criticism. Everybody starts out at this place, but you want to be able to push yourself to get to 50, 100, even as many as 300 or more for any source that is put in front of you, whether it be a source that you yourself chose or that comes from your own research. And we're going to sort of show you why in this next part. So this method, as opposed to, or in concert with the first step, is deductive. So in the beginning, we just said, hey, this is the definition of a meaningless question. Here's a source, go at it, no other guidance, no other sort of instructions. For meaningless question flashcards, we approach the same process, meaningless questions, from the other direction. So if we come back to the source that we just looked at, and we look at, say, 3 of the questions that either were asked or that we've seen before, what do we have? Well, we have who decided that a serving size is 1 cup? Okay. Why did they choose a sans serif font for all of this? Cool. How come all of the carbs aren't listed? Great. These are all meaningless questions. They fit the bill. But as you can probably see, these are different types of questions. I mean, the font questions about graphic design, about the visual dimension of this, who decided is more of a question about authority within the medical industry or the food industry, like who gets to decide what goes in my body and what constitutes a normal body. And so the idea here is that already in the list of the chat of meaningless questions, there are different kinds or dimensions of inquiry that are going on. So if we translate these questions into dimensions of inquiry, it might look something like this. The who decided that a standard serving size equals 1 cup is what we call the standard dimension of inquiry. Who chose that particular font we refer to as the dimension of inquiry tone. Why aren't all of the carbs listed here? We have another dimension of inquiry we call limit. And on the flip side of each of these cards is a definition of the dimension, and then a few example questions of a sample source just to get you going and understand it. Now, here's the key. The idea is, let's say you were one of the people who asked, who decided that a cup is equal to 227 grams or something of that nature. The notion is, okay, now that I've asked one standard dimension of inquiry question, by all means, I could ask more. I could now deductively, intentionally try to ask 3 more or 5 more, 10 more, 20 more questions that are kind of walking along this axis. Think of like the x-axis, the y-axis, the z-axis. This is an n-dimensional space. You can walk along many different axes or dimensions of inquiry. I'm going to try to get 5 more questions out of this source that fit the standard. Who decided that only saturated and trans fat are listed? Come to think of it, what is a calorie? who decided on the 2,000 calories per day standard. And the idea is, well, in the beginning, I got to 15 meaningless questions inductively, and I ran out of steam. Let me pull a card from the deck or virtually, figure out what the dimension of inquiry basically is talking about, and then push myself to ask 5 more, 3 more, 10 more meaningless questions of the source. Now, you will run out of steam again. It's not as if you're going to get to 300 just by following this one dimension of inquiry. And so then as soon as you run out of steam, you move on to the next card. It doesn't matter which card you pull. It doesn't matter which order you go in. It can be, it's nonlinear. Maybe the next card you pick up is tone. You flip over the card, you see what it's about. You keep going. You run out of steam. You ask 5 more, 10 more questions. You run out of steam. You pick up the limit card. You turn it over. If you go through the deck of 25 dimensions of inquiry and ask just 3, 5, let alone 10 questions of each, you will arrive at 100, 200, 300 or more meaningless questions about a single source. And what that allows you to do is to go back to the process that Chris referred to, this ask, analyze, share, etc. But you have a much bigger starter set to choose from. When you're choosing your favorite MQ to answer, now you have 300 possible starting points, and you have more ability to say which one is your favorite. When you're trying to figure out what are the patterns in the questions that I'm asking or that my mentee is asking, you obviously have way more to go on if you have 300 or 100 questions from them rather than just 10. So we're actually going to try this out right now. Arvin, thank you so much. I feel it too. I think Chris and I, we feel it too. This is a very simple, an amazing process to get these fleck of paint questions up and surfaced. So let's try this again. We're going to go to a real source that one of you provided. We wanted to do this anonymously. Step 1 of this process is exactly the same as before. Ask as many meaningless questions as you possibly can inductively. And I'm just going to turn to the next slide and then turn it over to Chris. Please, on your device or on your computer, just navigate to where the QR code is sending you or to pollev.com/tsmullaney. You may have to press skip. You don't have to register. You don't have to do anything of that nature. All you have to do is skip if it asks you to log in. And eventually you get to a place where you just type in your screen name and then your meaningless questions. Okay. So we're going to give you a second just to log in. Let us know if you're having any trouble in the chat and we'll help you. And then we're going to show you the source, and then we're going to show you the cards in action.
So again, if you can't scan the QR code, just type in pollev.com/TS Mullaney. And again, this is a real source, real researcher here today. And we're going to capture all of these responses through the poll because that makes it easy for us to send it to them. So they are going to be able to receive all of your questions anonymously. And this is going to help them directly. So you're helping them through the inductive mode first, then we're going to switch to the deductive mode. So please log in, pollev.com/TS Mullaney, or scan the QR code, skip whatever you need to skip. You'll see the source, and then you should be able to start typing in questions there. You can write as many questions as you want to. You can write questions as we're talking and going along. So just keep the poll open after you've opened it and start typing. And we'll give a couple minutes for people to write about this. If for some reason,
the source.
yes, so if for some reason you cannot reach the poll, for some reason, you can just type your questions in the chat. That is also fine too. And we will collate them and we will share them with this researcher. So this is the source. Let's take a few minutes.
We'll do this time.
All right, 2 minutes. Here we go.
All right, the questions are starting to come in. I know it's not visible to everyone, but we have it on the back end here. And already just by doing it once, you could probably feel that it's easier to do it the second time, even before we get to the flashcards, because now you kind of get it. You're not being so hard on yourself, so performative. I mean, I wonder about, the sort of triangularity. I know certain signs are kind of posed in landscape and some are portrait, but then some are kind of diamond shaped. Are diamond-shaped signs reserved for certain kinds of signs? Like if you were to line up all the diamond-shaped signs in all, in a particular country, would there be a pattern to those kinds of signs, or is it completely random? What kind of marker or something did the person use to cross out share and own? How does the ink in that respond to weather? Is the acidity of rainfall slowly degrading the letters of OWN there? What is the size and gauge of the bolt that is used to attach those signs to the pole? Is it screwed directly into the pole, or is there like a metal fastener on the other side? Is this at eye level? How high is this off the ground? All right, 30 more seconds. Keep it going. And then after you're done, don't close the poll. Keep it open. All right.
I should mention, I had not seen the source before today. So I'm just going to start writing my own MQs
I saw it
in
a
there.
few seconds ago. Awesome. Okay, so let's say that you only have 2 minutes just for now. And obviously, the timing of this is just a little bit arbitrary. But now, keep the link open. And just in the chat, just let us know how many questions you got. It doesn't have to be, ballpark. Did you get, cool, 5? Sherry got 5, 9, 9, 4, 6. Cool. All right. That's great. 8. And this was a shorter amount of time. This was 2 minutes instead of 3.
Again, these are all going to the researchers. So this is fantastic.
This is great. Still thinking too much. Sorry. Yeah, that's the thing is,
very common.
Effectively, the watchword is don't think twice. I mean, literally, it's don't think twice, just think once. That's the Fleck of Pain question. Once you start thinking twice, you're performing your intelligence, not enacting your intelligence anymore. Okay. Step 2 is where we're at now. So keep the link open. And now we're going to use the flashcards to try to get more questions out of this exact same source. Okay, so you still have this open. The link is in the chat. Still have it open. But now we're going to use this, one of the 25 dimensions of inquiry we call sense. So the way that, if you were to flip over the physical card or the virtual card, you can see that there's a very basic definition. What does the item feel, smell, sound, or taste like? The example is a binder clip. Just to give you a sense, does the binder clip hurt one's fingers to open? What sound does it make if the clip breaks? Does it leave an indentation on the paper it binds? Does metal have a smell, etc.? These are just meant to get you in the ballpark of this dimension. Don't overthink the dimension. Don't be too stressed out about it. But now the idea is if we use this dimension of inquiry and we go back to this road sign, try to ask just one more question of the source. One more question of the source inside inside the survey. So yeah, so Chris just asked a question. What does the ink smell like? How about exhaust from the truck next to the sign? These are sense questions. What did it sound like to the person who was taking the photograph at that moment? All right, good. All right, so more questions are coming in. Excellent, excellent. Did you get just one, or did maybe more than one occur to you over time? Is it easy to find one more question? More than one? Awesome. Yeah, okay, cool. So we place this as minimum as possible, just one more question. Let's imagine then that you're getting exhausted again, you're getting tired again, you're running out. Maybe your performative intelligence is insisting itself back into the situation and taking over and you're like, no, performative intelligence, go back to the couch. I don't need you right now. Let me pull another card. We're just going to do one more card and then we'll sort of show you. Mimic. This is an entirely different dimension of inquiry. So think of these as, again, the X dimension, the Y dimension, the Z dimension. Every one of these dimensions is infinite. You could ask, these are not just, let me ask one more question. This is an entire space in which you can ask as many questions as you want. Mimic is defined as, is the item patterned after something else, or is it completely new? And the example in the card, just to get your mind going, is a grocery cart. And when shopping carts were first invented, were they patterned after other kinds of carts, woven baskets, coal mining carts? If yes, was the mimicry deliberate or inadvertent? So go into the same link, don't close the link, look at the signs and try to ask just one more, maybe more, but just one more meaningless question using the dimension of inquiry of mimic. Awesome. Yeah, I was wondering about Chris. I was wondering about the yellow of the sign too. Like if you actually like did the hex code value of the yellow of that sign, is it the same as the hex code value as, I don't know, the yellow of a yellow stoplight sign or a bus?
Is it a safety yellow? Like
it is a safety yellow. Yeah, like if we track down the equivalent of who decides on the font of the FDA label, is there a document somewhere that says that safety yellow has to be of a certain luminosity, otherwise it's illegal? Awesome. Okay, so questions are coming in. Was it easy to ask another question using this dimension of inquiry, or was it hard? And did you find yourself able to ask maybe more than just one more meaningless question? Maybe throw that in the chat, please. All right, more than one. Okay. Harder than senses. Awesome. This is really useful too. Some dimensions of inquiry will be more natural for some than others. And this is also useful information. If you pull a card and you just like get it and you start running with it and you pull another card and it's like pulling teeth, that too is something that's really valuable for you as a researcher and even your mentor to understand. It's like, wow, that's this one dimension of thought really, really comes natural to you. I wonder if you have ever read the book by so-and-so, who also sort of thinks in this way, and see what happens. So thank you very much to the researcher who shared this source. We're going to compile all of these, and then we're going to kind of give it back to you. But let's close this out and then open it up for Q&A with the obvious question, and I'm going to turn it over to Chris. How many dimensions of inquiry are there actually? Are there really only 25, or could there be more? What do we think, Chris?
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because Paulette asked, what would the sign taste like if I licked it?
I love it. I love it. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Like, I think Paulette may win she asked a lot more meaningless questions than me. But yeah, so essentially like you can get the sense like these cards are really helpful for generating questions, which may seem nonsensical, but they will definitely produce ideas for the researcher and for anybody who's like eavesdropping or participating in this conversation. And like one of the next dimensions of the dimension of inquiry thing is think of your own, right? Like this is really when you push into the realm of like radical originality, is if you can invent your own dimensions, and if you can also identify dimensions that are like latent or hidden within whatever questions you're asking. So it's one thing to ask the question, it's another thing to categorize the questions or to say, oh, I seem to be thinking within this dimension of inquiry. And we have all gotten stuck just asking questions in one dimension or a limited range of dimensions. And we have definitely seen this in other people. So this is what we're trying to break through. And I guess the answer to this question is there are unlimited numbers of dimensions. And this is part of kind of the ongoing fun and challenge of research, is to be constantly exploring these new dimensions and not just being trapped by what we think our source is about, but what the topicality of the source is, and really allowing yourself to think radically differently, think horizontally, and to encourage other people to move to this metacognitive dimension that Tom was talking about.
And right, quite literally, this one the card deck has 25 dimensions of inquiry, but just Chris and I have identified 100 in all. So there are going to be kind of expansion decks and additional cards that are added to the virtual. We have this poster that we give out at our workshops, which have 100 dimensions of inquiry. Not all of them are in the virtual or the physical deck now, but they're kind of coming soon. And then, like Chris mentioned, there are actual cards in the deck itself, which are blank. This is a picture of one of the cards. You turn it over, and basically we're inviting you to get out a Sharpie. Sharpie pens work the best, we've discovered, and just create your own. Look at the meaningless questions that you asked of a source and ask yourself, okay, either does this fit any of the ones that Chris and Tom are talking about? No, it doesn't. This is a different dimension that I'm asking about. Okay, what would I call this dimension of inquiry? What kind of question is this? Let me make my own card. And we actually want to, not yet on the website, but we will have a place where you can share your dimension and where
You can
kind
do
of
it in the chat, like
community-created
Arvind is already
dimension.
writing it in.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as these occur to you, please do write them in.
Awesome. So we want to just do a Q&A now. We want to open this up and stop sharing, but we know that when we sent out the email, we said basically that today was the deadline for the early bird. We're going to extend it by a week for those who are here with us. And so we know actually from the names and everything that many of you already have your cards or the virtual version. But if you are interested in learning more, we're going to throw this link also in the chat. And you can explore. Maybe you can get one for yourself. Sherry, maybe called Trigger. That is absolutely awesome. There was just as a side note, when we did a workshop in Palo Alto in January, someone in the room asked if it was okay to ask a particular meaningless question. Their meaningless question was, they were looking at a source, and outside the window of the room where we were in, there was a bird chirping. And his meaningless question was, what is the species of bird that is chirping in the background as I look at this source? And his question to us was, is it okay for that to be my meaningless question? And the answer is yes, absolutely. And it turns out that the guy is a birder. He has like lots of interest in this. I mean, this is the kind of thing that if someone in office hours just broke script and started asking questions about the bird chirping outside my office window, that actually is incredibly useful for the conversation about research mentorship. It seems unlikely, but it absolutely is. So just wanted to throw that out there.
That's not why we said early bird, though. That's a coincidence. Yeah. So what's on people's minds? Like, what are the research scenarios or conversations you've had that have gone well or not well? Or you can tell that we're very interested in kind of breaking through in different ways into new dimensions that are impossible to predict at first, especially when you're dealing with someone else. You just do not know what's in their mind. And so you need some way to kind of bring that out of them.
So we have a first question. Ulysses asked it, and it's great to see you, Ulysses. I don't know when you joined, but there was a section where we discussed what you do with the meaningless questions. Chris, do you want to do like a super fast recap of that for Ulysses?
Sure. There are a few things that you can do. The way that we kind of categorize that just in a quick and dirty way would that you can analyze the questions. You can see what are some of the patterns that you find, what kinds of questions does the researcher seem to be asking. You can group them. You can see as they're kind of like a heat map of concerns, where like one area of questioning, one line of questioning seems to be dominant. So if you can identify that just by like highlighting, you could highlight, within one color of certain types of questions and other questions in a different type of color. You can, prioritize them. You can see, is there any kind of hierarchy of concerns within these questions? That would be another thing that you can do. And you can then share these questions with other people. So that's a lot of what we've been doing today is like we are surfacing the questions that are on our minds, that are within us, making them visible so that other people can then respond to them in different productive ways. You can improve their recommendation algorithm so that if they are trying to help you out and suggest, oh, why don't you read this study or that book or look for this type of source, they will have a better sense of where you're coming from and what's on your mind. And then the third thing would be to also try to answer the questions. So to kind of pick one or two or a small group of questions and to do searches for them and to see what you come back with. And one of the things we emphasize is that in the process of answering questions, this will be generative of many positive things like new questions. You may discover answers to a different question than the one you were asking.
And we can, Ulysses, I will share with everybody, but we'll share with you also the that part of the slide deck from today's webinar, and also the link to the webinar if you want to cycle back. That's a great question. Charles has a question. I'll field this one. I noticed that the whole process starts with a source. Is there a process for finding or identifying a source? My undergrads seem to run into trouble coming up with what source they want to use. This is a really great question. So, I mean, I know I face this problem too. So let's put aside the scenario in which someone does have a source. They a particular passage of a text, a film that they love, a particular play, a particular building, a particular photograph. Like they're not a data array. They're not coming in with something. What do you do? One thing that has often worked for me is if someone comes in with a vague sense of a topic, I actually do like to get them talking about kind of when was the first time that this topic occurred to them, and get them talking in a more almost biographical sense of, do they remember when they first put into words that they were concerned with something? And I'll give you an example from a student who is concerned about historical memory of the Holocaust in Eastern and Central Europe. And, that was the sort of topic. There was no particular source that the person had brought in to talk with me. And, but we, again, prompted by, can you just walk me through, when you first sort of put it into words in that way? And the student said, yes, I was at like a flea market in, I don't know if it was in Warsaw. And I noticed that the flea market salespersons were quite literally selling things that they claimed to be part of the set for the movie Schindler's List. And I've just sort of never stopped thinking of that moment. Like I was, I went to a flea market, and I was a study abroad student, and I was just really surprised to see people selling not things from the World War II era, but stuff that was ostensibly left behind by the shooting of the film Schindler's List. And I said, let's make that the source. That experience, that memory, just take a picture of that moment in your mind. That becomes the thing that we can ask not just 10 meaningless questions of, but ideally 100, 200, 300 meaningless questions of. How does one become a flea market salesman in Warsaw? Are these things actually props from the movie? Who managed the props for the movie Schindler's List? And we go on and we go on and we go on. And that becomes, Chris and I use the word source in a somewhat expansive, but also a very specific way. Like a source, by the way we're using it to be this inspiration moment for meaningless questions, has to be something that you can kind of literally or figuratively put on the table in front of you. Something small, you can hold it in your hands, so to speak, and another person can also look at it figuratively or literally. It's not an idea. It's not, I'm interested in early childhood cancers. It's not, I'm interested in climate change's effect on the Antarctic. That is not something you can put in front of you. You want something, either a literal source of a data array, the picture of a cell, or it could be, in this case, a kind of conceptual version of a source. Your memory of being a study abroad student in Warsaw in a flea market in which people are selling things from Schindler's List, prop list, and so forth. So that is another technique for getting it completely localized. And once you have it localized, meaningless questions is perfectly, that's when you're in action. And I just wanted to report, thank you. I won't name you by name, but I start to see the early bird orders coming in. So really excited to get these out to you. I promise to send it to you as soon as we log off. But yeah, we have another question. Chris, why don't you take that one?
Sure. Yeah, actually, the question that Charles asked and that Gore asked about, could you each share a question that you asked or your colleague student asked that led to your breakthroughs? Actually, I feel like this happens all the time. I'll give just one example. That there was a student who, and Charles, I think you'll like this one too. That a student came to my office hours to discuss her final project and said, I'm going to do a research project on why all translations of modern Chinese literature into English are wrong. I was like, okay, you have my attention, but I don't know if I'm gonna, I don't know if this project has a future. So I asked like, why, what brought you to that? And this student mentioned she had read a story by the famous writer Lu Xun, one of the most famous stories in modern Chinese literature, Diary of a Madman. And she said, I don't think it should be translated as Diary of a Madman. And I said, why not? Right? Everyone's always translated as Diary of a Madman. And she said, well, when I look at the diary itself, the very first thing in the very first entry by the madman is, tonight the moon is very bright. And the second one is like, tonight there's no moon at all. Those are the first two things that the madman writes in the diary. I think it should be Diary of a Lunatic, because Luna is moon, and the person, the madman, this story is influenced by the moon. I think it should be lunatic. And so I was both like bowled over by this student finding something new to say about a writer whose works have been just combed over and studied to death. And in fact, this inspired me last fall to do an entire fourth year research course on Lu Xun, because I think there is more blood in this orange or this stone. And indeed, like, students came up with new dimensions of inquiry. There's one student who wanted to understand modern Chinese dentistry through this modern Chinese writer. And so like teeth were their dimension of inquiry, and one that I would have thought of, but that has given me a lot of other questions about modern Chinese literature. So I feel like this happens all the time. And if you can just create the conditions for people to surface the things that they noticed, it can be fantastically revolutionary.
Yeah. We have a question that's coming through the Q&A. By all means, throw things in the Q&A as well. But Arvind asked, have you facilitated MQ with entrepreneurs or founders or any groups outside of typical research domains? The answer is yes, and kind of in the last, that's been a feature of 2024. So the workshop that we did in January, which was our first foray into this, it had colleagues from UCLA and University of Texas and Princeton, but also from Apple, from Walmart Labs, from Bain Capital, from Finnegan, this very large IP firm. And we're doing another one where we're also going to be joined. And what's fascinating is something that Chris and I suspected was true, but didn't know until we had confirmation, was that the problem we talk about in Where Research Begins is shared across all academic fields. The problem of the phase of research where someone vaguely knows what they're doing and maybe even making progress, but doesn't know the problem they're actually working on. That applies to biologists, obstetrics, it applies to psychology, business, and so forth across academia. What we've discovered in 2024 is that it's also true in the arts, nonprofit sector, venture capital. There was this amazing discussion with someone from that world who said something where they could have been talking about a dissertation advisee. What this person said was, the number one thing that founders don't realize is that they're not signing up for like a 2-year gig. They're signing up for something that they have to commit to, starting a business, for 10, 15 years. And I was like, oh my gosh, you could take the word start a business and commit to a dissertation, at least in a North American context of not maybe a Western European 3-year context, but certainly a 7-year context, that you're signing up and committing to something that is of a greater scale. So having just a good idea for a business is not enough. It's got to be something that you're going to stay with long after the shine has worn off, and that you're just, you're trudging through, and you're trudging through because you're committed to it, and you're committed to it because there is something about it that is you are in that. Like by working on this, there's some dimension that I'm kind of home when I work on a project that matters to me deeply, as opposed to just working on a cool idea that my brain produced for me, where the sheen wears off very quickly. And then I could reasonably ask the question, why am I trying to get this business off the ground again? And so, yeah, we don't really know what's going to happen with those conversations, but we have started to have those conversations, and are hoping to explore that more. Cool. I think we have another question in the Q&A. Anonymous attendee, Chris, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll loop back to Sherry's question in a minute. But the anonymous attendee's question is, right, in the book, we are first tasked with finding our problem by finding patterns in our educated questions. Then we are shown or asked to ask many more questions of our primary source that relate to our problem. If we have already identified our problem, what is the benefit of asking even more questions and multiple genres of questions at that with our primary source?
Awesome
This,
question.
I think, has to do with that the crucial question of how do you deal with uncertainty in the research process, and kind of how do you maintain a type of productive uncertainty that allows you to remain open-minded and flexible without like spinning off into, a black hole. So I think this is one that does require like, trying to stay flexible and not feeling like, oh, I have like a absolute certainty about what my problem is and what I'm going to do with it. That allows you to realize that kind of a problem is something that you can be in the realm or the sphere of, but a problem and the questions, they can be completely different things. Like your problem will be generative of many different questions that you need to answer in order to kind of solve the problem to the best of your ability. And so you don't want to conflate the two things. And you do want to kind of use these dimensions of inquiry to test your certainty. And what's going to happen is you'll either get greater certainty, like, yes, I'm on the right track, or no, actually, there's something I didn't consider. And this completely changes my perspective on my project. And so I think this is something that, again, it's an iterative process. It's uncertain because you don't know what the actual outcomes are going to be, but you will improve your research if you go through this process. And sometimes it'll be just a minor tweak. Sometimes it can be a more radical shift.
Yeah. I'm going to take Sherry's question and loop in just a tiny thing about this anonymous question, which is fantastic. So Sherry asked, how much did you use meaningless questions in writing your book, creating the deck, workshop, resource? What was your process? I think that, like many things in life, you sort of discover it too late. And so I would say, just speaking for myself, that I wish I had had something explicit at the outset of my own dissertation or whatever along these lines, because, and this is why we put this in two different slides in the presentation today, is decision fatigue is a waste of time. Decision fatigue is a waste of life. You don't want your cognitive energy, your metabolic energy. Thinking is a whole body process. It's not a brain in a box process. And you ideally want your intelligence to not be wasting untold joules of energy deciding what to even think about or what to even do. You want it just to think about what you're thinking about and take it from there. And so that's why that we underscore that meaningless questions, one of the really valuable things of it is not just that it surfaces the fleck of paint question or the these other examples. It does so without exhausting you in the process. You still have charge left in your battery to do something with those meaningless questions after you've done it. But I think probably, at least for my journey, probably around the halfway mark of my dissertation, and then certainly for every book I've written since, a meaningless question, we didn't call it then because we've just given it the name now, a kind of meaningless question exercise was part of the process from that point on. And it is designed to reveal things that I'm thinking about a source that I might not even be aware of, also draw upon things that I might be ignoring and that I shouldn't be ignoring about a particular source. So I would say in my own journey, the thing that is what Chris and I would now refer to as meaningless questions was probably there from too late in the stage in grad school, and then mercifully for the entire career. On the question of this anonymous attendee, which is the one about when do you stop this process, is really, really important. So I know for my students, if they're in the beginning of the research process and they don't know what they're doing, they have a topic they're interested in, they think they're interested in, and I can tell that they are not ready or should not be ready to commit to a project. It is premature. If they commit to that project, they might feel like they're getting ahead, but in fact, they're falling behind because every step they take in the wrong direction is 2 steps they ultimately need to take to double back. And so often I will have 2 versions of meaningless questions. The first version is the one that everyone here just went through, which is unbounded, no parameters. Literally, you think you're interested in this photograph? Okay. Ask questions about the content of the photograph, but I do want you asking questions about the chemical composition of the photographic paper, the photographic development process. I do want you to be asking about all of these. I want you to come at this as many dimensions as possible, because then we're going to figure out what is it about this photograph that actually disturbs you in some sort of positive way. I believe you that this photograph matters to you. I believe you that this moment at a flea market in Warsaw matters to you. That is objectively true. What we don't yet know is, what was it about that moment that is the reason why it lingers in your memory for years and years and years and years. And that's what an unbounded meaningless question process is. But then let's say we go through the process that Chris and I talk about in the book, and let's say that the person is beginning to be able to articulate, yes, I want to work on Holocaust memory in Eastern Central Europe. That's my topic. My problem, I'm pretty sure, is this. In that case, I will still have the researcher go through the meaningless question process, but I may allow them to place constraints or parameters on it. At that point, I may say to them, okay, you're no longer asking the question, what does the photographic paper taste like if I were to chew it in my mouth? Maybe you're not asking that meaningless question, but neither do you want to zoom in like a laser and ignore all of the other dimensions of your sources. So we're still doing meaninglessness, but maybe you could call it parameterized or slightly bounded meaninglessness, because the person does know what they're working on. There's no need to go back to that full-scale meaninglessness, perhaps, but it still is really valuable to keep doing this exercise even when you're pretty far along in the process.
Let me jump into just to respond to Sherry as well, that, how much did we use meaningless questions in writing our book and creating the deck and workshops and resources? I will say that more and more I'm a big believer in workshopping ideas, and we've done this extensively. We did this extensively for Where Research Begins, right? Where we met in cafes and we workshopped just the 2 of us. We invited in friends, or we invited in strangers and workshopped exercises and ideas. We did this again and again. We are still doing it. We're doing this with every new project, like both our individual projects, our teaching projects, and our joint writing projects. It's just fantastically productive, and including like today's session. Like, this is part of the work, the kind of idea generation process for all of us, because you just don't know what you're going to find. And one of the reasons it's good to do this with a kind of heterogeneous group, people at different career stages, people in different fields, is they essentially are bringing their own different dimensions of inquiry to the table. Some of those you may be able to identify right away. Others you may not know what the agenda is, but it's really inspiring to come into contact with that and to see how people may be perceiving you and perceiving your ideas. And this is essentially what happens every time you apply for a grant or every time you do a job talk, is that you're standing in front or presenting to people who may come to your topic with different dimensions of inquiry. And so if you have kind of tested yourself in these different ways, you're going to be a bit more able and prepared to respond to them as well and to engage with them in a meaningful way. So that's again, I think, part of the fun of this type of research and teaching career.
Yeah, dimension. Yeah, that's a great point. Helen, I'll take your question. Is there a way to use this process to pull together all the dimensions you've examined? You've got a complex topic and are wrestling how to pull it together into a singular book. Now what? Yeah. So probably a visual diagram would help in the process I'm going to give you a quick nutshell of right now. But if we could always follow up. Well, Chris and I will throw our emails and our LinkedIn in the chat as well to connect. But I'm leading a research seminar right now, and actually two, one for undergrads and one for grads. We're doing meaningless questions throughout the process. And we have identified, each of them has identified a source, something that matters to them, something that really kind of, is exciting to them for whatever particular reason. Each one of them has generated 300 meaningless questions minimum about that. We went through the process that Chris described before of sort of sorting out and categorizing the questions into different kind of thematic units, what Chris and I refer to as dimensions of inquiry. And then what often I do with the student is say, okay, take those dimensions, take those clusters, take those thematic clusters of questions, maybe question 1, 3, 13, 14, 32, 132, kind of go together in some weird way, but questions, X, Y, Z go together in a different way. At the end of the process, if you start with 100 meaningless questions, 200, 300, you'll end up with, I don't know, 10 buckets of questions, 10 thematic units at least, and then a bunch of miscellaneous ones that you don't know quite where to put. What you can do at that point is you look back over those clusters of questions, and once again, you ask which one or more of these themes really lights me up. So the metaphor that Chris and I use a lot in the book and in any workshop is, imagine you're just plugged into an EKG machine and it's reading your biorhythms. And all it's doing is telling you when you're getting excited and when you're just kind of meh about something. You can do that process with your meaningless questions, because we all know that some of the questions you all asked about the FDA label or the bike sign, they're just questions you thought of. Your brain came up with them, and that's awesome. You don't feel any lightning bolt having asked that. But some questions are different. Some questions that come out of our own mouth go back into our own ear, and it's like, wow, I'm kind of impressed by my own question. I'm like really into that. My EKG is spiking. And it's like, okay, that's really useful for you as a researcher and for me as a mentor, when we're both trying to figure out what your problem is. What are you doing here? And so let's say you've got 10 of these clusters of meaningless questions, and 5 of them seem really cool and important to the researcher, and the other ones are just, run of the mill. Well, let's focus, let's zoom in on those 5. And let's say that we're working on the final project for my class is a research grant. It's actually not a final paper for this class. That comes next quarter. It's a grant proposal. Say, all right, well, in the grant proposal template, you've got basically space for 3 themes. You've got an intro, you've got 3 themes you want to look at, and then you've got a conclusion or an outro. You've got 5 clusters of questions that really light up your EKG. Let's choose 3 of them to focus on. And so what I'm getting at here is you can go from a list of just from one source. You can start with one source, generate 300 meaningless questions, go through this categorization process, this EKG process, and you can arrive at either a full-fledged grant proposal, and I mean like really, really well-written grant proposal, or if you have sufficient amount of time in the semester, or maybe it's a year-long honors thesis, you can actually start the process of answering your questions, developing experiments that can test what happens to the nutrition value of the contents of this milk if we allow it to rot on the countertop. That's not something that Chris and I have the training to do, but Paulette Levantine in the chat does know how to teach someone how you would build an experiment to go about that. Someone asked, why is it that font? I do have the training to help a student know how you do the archival or historical work to figure out that answer. And so suddenly you're moving from a source to a paper, a source to a research grant proposal. And this is the key, and then I'll turn it over to Chris for the next question, is nowhere in the process has decision fatigue jumped in to spoil or waste your energy. Every step of the process is a balance between this more instinctual part of all of our intelligence and the performative side of our intelligence. They're working in tandem, and never is the researcher worried like, oh gosh, what should I do next? What should I do next? What should I do next? Which eats up a lot of time if you play those mind games in research.
Ray's question here, I think, is a big one about, do you have any advice or can you share experiences of advising, mentoring students who are resistant to moving away from performative intelligence to engaging and asking meaningless questions. And so just responding to what Tom shared about perhaps putting boundaries or parameters on the questioning, are there other strategies similar to that? I do think that one we mentioned earlier about trying to get the person to actually bring the source or share the experience or what they read, if they can identify that thing, that kind of forces them to come down from 30,000 feet. And that's also one way you can just phrase it about like, that's a huge idea. Like that is such a complex thought. Why don't we go back to like, what was the thing that brought you here in the first place? That can then give you some actual meat to chew on. And also a frame of reference that both people can discuss, because a lot of time is often wasted just trying to understand what is the person's frame of reference, like what is the researcher's frame of reference. And so if you tell them that, they can often not feel very threatened by it and realize it's a kind of a clarification question. They don't have to defend anything. So to the extent that you can make them feel like they're not in a dissertation defense mode, they will be more likely to open up. And all of the things that we've been mentioning about finding ways to reduce decision fatigue, where it's just like, this is the card, like we're just going to shuffle the deck and here's the card to look at. Then the person doesn't feel like there's a lot of pressure because it's a little bit arbitrary, but they will still have an opportunity to surface their concerns and surface their line of questioning. And then you as the mentor can be like, I think I see the pattern behind this person's concerns. And so I think I can improve my recommendations to them.
Yeah, yeah. Charles has a question which ties into that. I'll take it. Why do you call them meaningless questions? I have some idea what the answer is, but I'd like to hear how the term came about. I mean, at the core of it, the notion, I mean, at some basic level, of course, there is no question that is utterly meaningless. And we know that. And there is no question that one can ask that is not itself an act of interpretation. Interpretation has already started once a question has been asked. But what we found, and I know that you have found this just by virtue of the profession you have and just the experience, is that students want to, and even advanced researchers want to jump pretty quickly to very, very higher orders of interpretation rapidly. And in fact, sometimes we even inadvertently make them do that with, at least in history, these kinds of classic questions of source criticism. What was the intended audience? What might, these questions that are in fact extremely sophisticated. If you think about the notion of someone having been in the presence of a primary source for all of 10 seconds, and the question of who is the intended audience, how might have this been received, that's about 30 stories up in the air at that point. And so the idea of meaninglessness is to try to purposefully get the researcher to suspend the desire to just hit it out of the park on their first at bat and just, sum up what it all means in one fell swoop, but to stay in the really rudimentary levels of interpretation. And so we kind of cheekily are saying that these are meaninglessness because the goal, even though it is an act of interpretation to say, why is that a sans serif font? It is still a question where the person is not aspiring or arrogating to meaning, to like explaining what it all means. They're holding back. And but at the end of the day, what this all ends up doing is if you ask a sufficient number of meaningless questions, and then you end up answering your first level meaningless question, why is it sans serif? I found the answer to that. Now I have a new set of meaningless questions, and you answer some of those. And you find out that it was a committee on the, some sort of government bureau that does that. Who are the members of that bureau? I found the answer to that. Where did this person do that? Research becomes a succession of first, second, third, fourth, nth order meaningless questions and answers. And what you end up doing over that process is you end up sneaking up on meaning from behind, so to speak. You end up sneaking up on higher level interpretation not coming at it directly. And what ends up happening is that the interpretations a researcher ends up having once they get to the 30th floor of their building or the 100th floor of their building are so much better than the insights and interpretations that they were trying to have when they were literally standing on the ground floor trying to jump to the 100th floor in one jump, like Spider-Man or Superman or something of this nature. And so the meaninglessness is meant to really try to short circuit that desire, which is part of all of us, but especially from high school onward, that we really do need to, is out of balance. That performative side of our intelligence is out of balance with the fleck of paint question side of our intelligence. And that's why we put it that way. Yeah, so let's see. I see you flagged a question there, Chris. Why don't you take that one?
Yeah, and for that one, this is a very practical question about how you incorporate things into the syllabus. And meaningless questions, one of the great things about them is you can do them at the beginning of every class. You can just put up a source on the slide or bring in some physical object and just have everybody write questions in a poll. I had students do this last fall just with pens on a whiteboard around the classroom. So everybody like gets up and starts moving around within the first 5 minutes. We also, if you see in the chat, I put down whereresearchbegins.com/MQ/mentors. We also have a kind of a quick start guide that has suggestions for how this can be incorporated into syllabus and the approximate amount of time you might budget for these types of activities if you're trying to do it within a day or over a week. So there's some ideas that you can take a look at there.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we're coming close to time. We want to be respectful of everyone's time. Ricky, yeah, no, it was our pleasure. Thank you for asking the question. So we'll have one more question. I'll go ahead and take that, and then we'll say our goodbyes. But we threw our LinkedIn in there, our email, and Rebecca, thank you so much. We added the link one more time for the meaningless question. Early birds, we see some people signing up for that, which is really exciting. We'll also send that out in a follow-up email. But and we'll have the recording at some point and we'll share it. But yeah, Joanne, with the final question here. In your classroom experience, is there a difference between doing MQs as an organic conversation or using signposting to scaffold it? Do students respond better when the exercise is identified and structured, or when they don't realize they're in an exercise? And will there be a sequel on writing? Wow. The short answer is yes, but that's to be revealed. You've got good instinct, Joanne. So yes, I do think that, in my experience, starting out the process is valuable. Like, I think I mentioned that I have a 200-person class that I'm one of the instructors in, and meaningless questions is simply the attendance mechanism. And I put simply in scare quotes because obviously it's not. It's serving an intellectual purpose, but this is a case where the student doesn't even necessarily know that at the beginning. It hasn't been explicitly said perhaps at the beginning, but it is doing the work. And so what I found, and again, Chris pointed this out, we're kind of always experimenting. What I've been experimenting with is how can meaningless questions be incorporated into my class in such a way that it doesn't eat up a lot of time. I still can cover everything I need to in my lecture. It serves a purpose for getting attendance. We use poll everywhere, but you can use other mechanisms too. But then after, 2 lectures per week, let's say 4 weeks of class, let's say they've done it 8 times. Then I introduce in class a primary source criticism exercise or an interpretation exercise. And quite literally, I can put a photograph in front of them, or maybe they have found one themselves and they're going to write a final paper on it. And they look at me and they say, the classic question, okay, Professor Mullaney, I found something in the source reader that's interesting, or I found it in the archives during our visit. What should I do? What should I do? I found the source. And at that point, I can say, ahaha, you've been doing it this whole time. The first thing I want you to do, Rebecca, with the source that you just found, is I want you to do exactly the same meaningless question exercise that you've already done 8 times as part of regular attendance. And so in it, like without them even realizing it, they have been limbering up and getting ready for game time. And I didn't waste a minute of pedagogical time on that process. And so suddenly then I can say, okay, here is this photograph, go at it. And in an alternate universe in which I'm asking the student who is the intended audience and all of these questions, and I'm basically triggering them to start showing off their performative intelligence with me, the quality of questions and interpretation from that is like really, really low. If I ask them, okay, now that you know how to do meaningless questions, unleash your MQ on this, the quality of that first pass on that primary source is 10x. And that's our starting point. That's the starting point for office hours, for TA discussions, for, follow up. Suddenly we're starting at 10x the starting point, and now we can really, really dive in. And so Chris and I have really discovered that this thing works one-on-one, it works in small group formats, but maybe for the first time in history, we have a way of bringing in actual research mentorship into a class of 300 people. We're not kidding. Like 300 people, you can have a meaningful, scalable experience of the research process. And that to me is really exciting because for many of my students, that's my only chance to interact with them is in a large format class. Awesome. Well, I know we are just so appreciative. Thank you so much for joining us. And we hope to stay in close touch. Chris, you want to lead us out?
I just echo that this is really fantastic. I haven't met most of you before. This is great to meet virtually. Hope we get to meet in person at some point. And yeah, please do keep in touch.